Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Rosanna Norman from GÉANT, and I'm here to welcome you to the first of our 4 webinars for this year's Cybersecurity Month campaign, which with the title, A Community of Cyber Heroes. Cybersecurity Month is an initiative that is launched by ENISA, the European Agency for Cybersecurity. And for those of you who are not familiar with GÉANT, just let me give you a little background. Actually, the first thing I should say is that on this occasion today, thanks to the collaboration we have with Red Clara, which is our counterpart for Latin America, and we are very happy about that. We have the international, we have the availability of live interpretation services in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So you can opt by going to the interpretation globe on the screen, at the bottom of the screen, and you can select the language that you want to listen to. This way, I should have probably said that at the beginning before starting the introduction. So in the meanwhile, if you can do that, that would be great. So can you already start listening to the introduction in the language that you prefer? So there is availability in 3 languages, as I said, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So going back to introduction about GÉANT, GÉANT is an organization that delivers a worldwide network and a portfolio of services for research and education, and we operate also a pan-European infrastructure, which is called the GÉANT network, and run a membership association for Europe's national research and education networks, known as NRENS, and it's called the GÉANT Association. So the main objective of the campaign of Cybersecurity Month is to increase knowledge and awareness of cybersecurity in the broad international research and education community by providing its members and users with targeted and tailor-made content and useful tools to be able to fight cybercrime. So everybody can be a cyber hero. This campaign will focus on 4 main target groups during each week of October. This week, which is this week, we will be targeting mainly decision makers. In the 2nd week, cybersecurity professionals. In the 3rd week, home workers, and the 4th week, students and researchers. So the webinars will be held by security experts from the industry and the wider GÉANT community. And there is something really new this year. As I said, we welcome and we're very excited and very happy to the collaboration with Red Clara, which is GÉANT's counterpart for Latin America. So we are welcome to all of you who are joining us today from across the pond, as they say. As I said, I mentioned before the translation services, and hope you're making use of that. For the colleagues who just, participants who just joined, just look at the globe at the bottom of the screen and select the language that that you want to follow. So for today's webinar, we welcome back actually Charl van der Walt, who is the head of security research for Orange Cyberdefense, and his talk with the title "Prime Crime: Ransomware has grown up, and we should too." This talk will highlight that there is a commonly held misperception that cyber technology is the dominant factor in cybercrime, but it isn't, because crime is the dominant factor in cybercrime. But I'll stop here and I'll let Charl do the talking. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour, including 15 minutes Q&A. So please use the Q&A function or the chat, and we will deal with the questions at the end of the talk. And happy listening, and Charl, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Rosanna, and thank you very much to everyone at GÉANT and from all over the world for joining us. It really is my privilege to be able to speak to a group of decision makers today about a topic that's very dear to my heart, cybersecurity, and specifically ransomware. As Rosanna very kindly introduced me, my name is Charl van der Walt. My role is that of the head for security research at Orange Cyberdefense. We are a European-centered cybersecurity product and services provider. And my role at the organization is really to try and understand as best as we possibly can what's going on in the cybersecurity space and to share that with our various stakeholders, both within and outside the company. So as Rosanna said, my topic today is to do with cyber extortion and specifically, or ransomware, as you probably know, and specifically, I want to focus on the question of ransomware as a crime. So with slightly less focus on the technical elements and more focus on what's actually happening from the perspective of the theory of crime. But I want to step back for a second and just share a personal anecdote. As you can possibly tell from my accent, I'm actually a South African, and I'm based here in Cape Town, where I'm speaking to you now. And you know, South Africa is a country that enjoys a little bit of crisis. In fact, we probably live with some version of crisis, some form of crisis at any given time. Right now, we're going through an energy crisis. We have a standing crisis with funds, with income and income inequality. Not too long ago, we had a water crisis. We have crises around public transport, and every now and again, we enjoy a good political crisis also. As you can see from this photo, it dates back to the 1980s. This is the university here in Cape Town, where students were protesting at that time the rules of apartheid. And when a crisis really gets bad and the government feels that they need to access extraordinary privileges and extraordinary resources to deal with the crisis, then the government declares what's called a state of emergency. And a state of emergency allows the government to access resources and to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And so I want to fast forward you from the idea of a state of emergency to deal with a political crisis in the 80s to a much more recent state of emergency, which was declared by the newly elected president of Costa Rica in May of this year. In fact, on May the 8th, when President Rodrigo Chavez was elected, or not elected, but appeared first as the president of Costa Rica, he also declared a state of emergency. And he declared that state of emergency in order to have access to privileges and resources that he felt his government needed to deal with a crisis which had started a month or two before in that country. But this time it wasn't a political crisis, it was a cybersecurity crisis, because the government of Costa Rica had fallen victim to a ransomware gang known as, I think it was Conti. And Conti had managed to compromise almost 30 government departments, including ministries of finance. The hack impacted their ability to collect taxes at the borders, to deal with correspondence from their people, etc., etc. In fact, the compromise was so bad and the impact on Costa Rica so significant that the president called it an act of war. He said, "We are at war." And specifically, we are at war with these hackers. So I'm just going to pause and check in. I'm getting a message that audio is intermittent. Rosanna, are you hearing me okay?
Loud and clear. Yeah, can you hear okay? For a moment, your audio was stopped for some reason. I don't know whether it was
I saw that I was
an error.
Yeah, I was muted there for a second.
So I think that's the only issue. Apart from that, I can hear loud and clear.
Wonderful. All right. So here we have President Chavez declaring a state of emergency because of this act of war. But while for the people and the government of Costa Rica, this would have been experienced as an act of war, for the Conti cybercrime group, it was really business as usual. And what you're seeing on this slide on the right-hand side is a screenshot of what we call the Conti News blog. It's a website published and maintained on the dark web, on which actors like Conti publish the victims that they've compromised. You can see Costa Rica at the middle and the bottom there, in the middle at the bottom. This is done to shame and put pressure on the victim to pay a ransom, but also to scare future possible victims into paying ransoms. And the actors will use these sites to escalate the pressure on the victim once the original initial ransom has been demanded. And you can see that after or since Costa Rica, there were at least 4 other victims at the time that we took the screenshot back in May. And on the left-hand side, you can see Conti's history. And you'll see that although Costa Rica experienced it as an act of war, in fact, Conti, since the beginning of 2020, has compromised, up until the time of this Costa Rica compromise, had compromised 764 victims in 42 countries. So Costa Rica was by no means an exception for them. It wasn't war for Conti, it was absolutely business as usual. And Conti is just one of in excess of 70 actors that we track day to day that use this technique. Here's a example of the leak site of another actor called Alpha V, also known as Black Cat. You see they use a similar approach. And here's an example of a leak from an actor called Hive. Now, the extraordinary thing about this approach to crime is that it's done in the public domain. So these sites, although they're on the dark web, we can't locate them physically. We can, once we know where they are, we can visit them just like anyone else can visit them. And that's kind of the point. And because we're able to do this, we get this extraordinary perspective into the scope and the nature of this crime through the lens of these actors and what they present. And here's an idea of how much data we have. Now, this dates to May of 2022. As of today, we have in excess of 5,200 victims recorded, as I said, about 70 actors. And over this period between January to May, we were looking at about 200 victims a month, spread across about 17 unique threat actors. Now, one of the things we can learn when we observe the crime in this way is that the nature of the crime is changing a little bit. So when I started this presentation, I referred to it as ransom or ransomware, and you'll understand ransomware as a crime in which data is exfiltrated, stolen by the attacker, by the criminal, and then encrypted in place so that the victim no longer has access to it. And that is partly correct. But what you'll see from this graph, if you look at the orange bars, is that in fact that form of extortion is decreasing quite significantly. And as of this year, we now see that only 14% of these crimes involve encryption of data in this traditional sense. And increasingly, other forms of extortion are being applied. For example, the threat simply to leak the data, the resale of the data, a threat of denial of service or actual denial of service, etc., etc. And what that leads us to conclude, which is an important starting point for today's discussion, is that what we are looking at here should not be called ransomware. Ransomware is a form of malware, it's a form of computer virus, if you like, which encrypts files on a computer. What we're looking at here is what we like to call cyber extortion, or CyEx, which is a form of computer crime in which the security of some corporate digital assets is compromised and exploited in a threat of some form to extort a payment. In other words, we need to start looking beyond the idea of this being an issue of malware encrypting files on a computer, zoom out and recognize that what we're dealing with here is basic extortion, closer to blackmail and not dissimilar to terrorism, When we zoom out like that, we can start to, firstly, we can start to look at this form of crime through other lenses. And today I'm going to introduce you to the lens of formal criminology. But we can also start to think about the problem in, I think, more mature ways. So if we look at the volumes of this crime over time now, what we'll note is that year on year, since we started observing it in 2020 on the left, it has grown significantly. In fact, between 2020 and 2021, it increased by about 65%. Now, you'll note that towards the middle of 2022, the volumes have started dropping again, and that is definitely an ongoing trend. So these volumes are decreasing in the short term. But as I hope to convince you today, we think that that is a temporary remission, and that in fact this crime is going, in some form or another, is going to continue growing as time goes by. And the reason for that, as I hope to convince you, is that because fundamentally all the elements that are required for this crime to persist remain in place. So nothing has changed fundamentally from those peaks at the end of 2021 to this trough that we're in now in the third quarter of 2022. And because nothing fundamentally has changed, we anticipate that this crime in some form or another is going to rebound, even if perhaps we're not able to observe it as closely and as easily as we are today. Now, our response to this crime in general has been framed as a technical one. And for those of you who were able to join me when I spoke last year, you'll remember that I shared a link to this paper that we published at Orange Cyberdefense. And it's not just dissimilar to many other papers published by many other players and government agencies and the like, that basically outline a set of technical controls that we can do to reduce the probability that we get compromised, reduce the probability that the actor can extract the data, and increase the probability that we can recover if and when that happens. And this technical guidance is normally broken down into 5 domains. We talk about anticipating the threat, so that we can prepare. We talk about identifying vulnerabilities. We talk about putting technical controls in place to protect us from attack. We talk about detecting attacks when they occur, and then responding to mitigate the impact of a breach. Now, technically, all of this is true, and a business that invests in these 5 domains is very likely to is less likely to become a victim of this crime, and is going to be more able to respond if they do fall victim. But as I said, I think that this crime, and I'm not here talking about the technical elements, I'm talking about the fundamental attributes of the crime, are systemic in nature. This crime is systemic in nature, and therefore is being driven by forces that will not easily be dissuaded by technical controls. And one way to think about that is to kind of think back to the golden age of the mafia, I suppose, in the 50s. And if you imagine the mafia as an organized, motivated, well-resourced criminal force that operates without any real fear of prosecution and is very successful in its ability to generate money, then you can very quickly understand that individuals living in that context who would improve their personal security, for example, by putting better locks on their doors, would not have any significant impact on the mafia's ability to operate. Now, again, to be clear, that individual may reduce the probability that, for example, they or one of their family gets kidnapped, but they would not have an overall impact on the mafia's ability or willingness to operate, to grow, to move into new domains, etc., etc. And I believe that the cyber extortion threat is of a similar nature, and that's because the attributes, the systemic attributes that created the mafia problem are very much in place today for the cyber extortion problem. So what we can do then is to step back a bit and examine the problem, not from the perspective of technology and the various digital locks we can put on our doors, but rather from the perspective of crime, by asking the question, like, why does crime actually happen? And some of you may be aware that the study of crime is a mature and robust discipline in academia. And there are several theories that are used to explain why crime happens, when it increases, when it decreases, and what we can do to deter it. One of the oldest and most well-established of those theories is something called routine activity theory, or RAT, which is a kind of ironic name. RAT was developed by two researchers called Cohen and Felsen. That's one of them in the picture here. I can't remember which one. I think it's Cohen. Developed all the way back in the 70s, actually. And as an old theory, it has the benefit of having been very deeply and thoroughly explored. It also has the disadvantage of perhaps in some ways having been surpassed by newer and more contemporary theories. But for the purposes of our discussion, it actually works very well. And so we're going to use RAT to examine the problem of cyber extortion with the hope of learning a bit more about how it works and what we could potentially do to prevent it. Now, what RAT says is that for a crime to occur, 3 elements need to be in place simultaneously. And I'm going to start on the bottom left. So the first is it says there needs to be a motivated offender. Now, that's the bad guy. And Cohen and Felsen actually weren't particularly interested in what the motivation of the offender was, or what the psychology of the offender was, or what their sort of socioeconomic circumstances were. Basically, what they're saying is that for crime to occur, there needs to be a person who has the means and the inclination to perform the crime. The next element is that there needs to be a suitable victim. Now, a victim under the theory of RAT could be a thing, it could be a person, it could be an organization. And its suitability speaks to how attractive it is to the criminal. So the more suitable a victim, the more likely the crime is to occur. And finally, the theory talks about the absence of capable guardians. You can think of guardians as people or things that stand between the victim and the offender. So if there were a policeman in a park where you're walking, you're much less likely to fall victim to a mugging. Similarly, if you have a strong lock on your gate, you're much less likely to fall victim to a robbery. But if the capable guardian is not in place, then there's a higher likelihood of the crime occurring. And basically what Cohen and Felsen were arguing is that the more these things converge, the higher the likelihood of a crime. And to the extent that we can impact any one of these 3 pillars, we can reduce the probability of a crime occurring. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, does this theory, can it be mapped to ransomware? And it turns out that if you define ransomware as cyber extortion in the way that we have, then actually that mapping works quite nicely. So we have within the crime a series of motivated offenders. And these could be the hackers that do the initial access, the IABs, or initial access vectors, initial access brokers, sorry. It could be the operators who design the malware and set the platforms in place to perform the crime, or it could be the affiliates, which are sort of franchisees. You then need a suitable victim, and I'll talk about this a lot, but any person or entity that has something of value in cyberspace could be a victim. Remembering here that the crime we're talking about is extortion. And in that crime, they are taking something from the victim that is of value to the victim. So the victim becomes more suitable the more they have something that's of value to them. This is not about something that's of value to the criminal. And then finally, you have this notion of capable guardians. And Cohen and Felsen define capable guardians as things like law enforcement, so police, things like security controls, in their time, locks and gates, in our time, firewalls and antivirus. Or, very importantly for Cohen and Felsen, they describe guardians as being just regular people going about their daily business that would serve as a kind of deterrent to crime happening. And I want to pause for a second just to illustrate that principle for you from their time. So Cohen and Felsen noted two things during their research which were very interesting. The one was they noticed that in the post-war era, at the sort of beginning of the baby boomer period, when in fact American society was very well off, crime was on the increase, not on the decrease. And particularly crime was in the increase in communities where people were well off and life was peaceful. And they were very intrigued about why that would be. And they identified two elements which kind of illustrate this principle in action. The first element that they noted was that at that time, people were buying consumer electronics. It was a new age where people could buy things like televisions and radios, which weren't really available to regular people before. And these consumers and these televisions and radios had high value and were easy to move. And so people became victims of crime because they had something that was of value to the criminal. And that was something that hadn't existed before. The other element that played a role was that women who before the war had largely stayed at home during the day, after the war, it started going to work. And so houses were empty. And because houses were empty, an important form of guardianship, which is the guardianship offered by regular people, was not in place. And so routine activity theory helped them to understand why crime was occurring in these very unlikely places. So with that understanding, the question we ask ourselves is, well, how can we apply routine activity theory to understand, but more importantly, to disrupt cyber extortion? And I want to take you through each of those three key pillars and just comment on them slightly and then offer some thoughts about how each of those pillars could either be countered or reinforced in order to reduce the likelihood of this form of crime occurring. And we're going to start with the offender, the motivated offender. So the offender is described or defined as an individual or group that has the skills and makes the decision to commit some element of the crime. And as I sort of suggested earlier, we're going to focus on the operators, the affiliates, and the initial access brokers. Now, so what we want to do is we want to find a way to, for lack of a better word, demotivate the offender. So the offender is always going to be there. There's always going to be people who have the potential to do these crimes. But how do we impact to make them less willing or likely to perform the crime? And the most obvious way to do that is, of course, through law enforcement intervention, right? We send the police after them. And in fact, there are examples, recent examples that illustrate or suggest that this may be an effective approach. And the most interesting one is of the Revil or Revile ransomware group, which was one of the top players up until late in 2021. In fact, Revil was famous for the Kaseya hack, which impacted, in one compromise, impacted over 200 companies and for which they demanded a $70 million ransom. And so REvil caught the attention of law enforcement and other government agencies, particularly in the US. And one of the things that happened in response was that the US Cyber Command, a government agency responsible for securing America's digital assets, launched an attack against their infrastructure and in fact compromised that infrastructure. And it gave REvil a huge fright. And you can see the quote there from one of the REvil administrators saying, "Oh, they're looking for me. Good luck, everyone. I'm taking off." And this REvil administrator ran away, basically, in response to this activity by law enforcement. Then later in November of the same year, the US government charged 2 of the REvil ransomware group. And then early in January, in collaboration with Russian law enforcement, several members of this group were in fact arrested. And if you look at the volume of attacks by REvil over that period, you can see that they were prolific and getting more and more prolific, all the way up until July, where the Kaseya hack happened. Then after Kaseya, they went quiet because they were aware of how much kind of political attention their crime was causing. Sort of came back a little bit and tried to make another go at it until the takedown in October. And then long before the 8 members were arrested by the Russian FSB, they had already ceased operations. So what this says to us is that the political kickback that resulted from their hack of Kaseya and other very prominent American businesses caused REvil to retract. The arrests actually, we can't gauge whether they had any significant impact or not. It may be or it may not be. If we zoom back and look more broadly at the crime and at various law enforcement interventions, we won't have the time to go into them in detail. But effectively, you can see 3 or 4 groups in this chart that we analyzed. And again, the law enforcement interventions are plotted against the volume of victims that we're able to observe using the data we have. And you see, starting in 2021, there was a significant effort to disrupt groups like Netwalker, Emitet, and Gregor. Then later, in the middle of 2021, dark web market was seized, a TrickBot developer was arrested, and there was significant efforts by the FBI to recover stolen funds. Then later, even in the 3rd quarter of 2021, there were some sanctions imposed against a Bitcoin exchange called Suex. Another group of ransomware actors was arrested by Europol, and police succeeded with another series of arrests. And then we see the REvil interventions at the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022. But what we note if we look at the numbers is that overall, the volumes of this crime seem completely impervious to these interventions. In fact, if we sort of take the 3 months after each one of these series of interventions, we'll note that the crime continues to grow. Now, of course, it could be that the dips that we're seeing there in the last quarter of 2022 are a result of these interventions. But we actually don't think that's the case. And one of the reasons we don't think that's the case can be seen in what's called a process that's called rebranding. So on this chart, you see the sort of cyan color, which represents REvil's activities. And again, you can see in July and August where they start to fade off. And immediately we can see other groups taking up where they left off, and particularly Lockbit, which is now the most prolific actor, was probably in some form or another simply a rebrand or a reconstitution of REvil's efforts. So just like the mafia, arresting a few of the goons or busting a few cells does not, in our opinion, have a meaningful impact on the motivation of these offenders on the whole. So if that's the case, well, what would have a motivation? And I'll draw your attention to my kind of synopsis on the right. The first is that very clearly demotivating the offender is going to take diverse strategies. And the fact that most of these offenders operate out of political domains like Russia, North Korea, and China, where they are, generally speaking, immune to arrest and prosecution, means that we have to think of other ways that we can counter them. And the most obvious way that presents itself is to stop the money flowing. Money, by and large, flows via cryptocurrencies using a variety of exchanges and mixers and tumblers. And effectively, we're of the opinion that if the money continues to flow to these actors, then they will continue to perform this crime in some form or another. And so although law enforcement interventions have been effective in making a few arrests and disrupting some infrastructure, as I was saying, we don't fundamentally see any significant change in the landscape in terms of how money is able to flow to these offenders. And so we argue that we're going to continue dealing with motivated offenders. This part of the equation, if you like, has not changed. So then the next element we need to look at is that of the suitable victim. And the suitable victim obviously needs to converge with the offender and the lack of guardianship in order for the crime to occur. Now, again, given our definition, we need to recognize that the victim in this case is going to primarily be an organization. It's the organization that's being extorted. And that the thing that's being taken from this organization is something that's of value to the victim, not something that's of value to the criminal. That's because fundamentally the crime is one of extortion, not one of robbery. So we can now examine various factors that may make an organization more or less suitable. And the first one that seems obvious to look at is the question of geography. So are there countries where victims are more attractive than other countries? And it's very clear from the graph you see here that there are significantly more victims in the US than in other countries. In fact, the breakdown that you see there has remained almost constant since the beginning of 2020 through into 2022, although I'll come back to that point in a moment. But if we compare the number of victims in any given country to the number of businesses in that economy, what we see is that with a few exceptions, there is a very strong correlation between the size of the economy and the number of victims. In other words, the reason we see more victims in the US is simply because there are more potential victims in the US. And the reason we see fewer in Australia, for example, is because Australia's economy is smaller and there are simply fewer victims. So while there are clear patterns regarding where these victims are located, this does not, in our mind, suggest that country is a variable that affects the suitability of the victim. We can take a similar look at the industry. And again, while there are a few notable exceptions, and I don't know if we'll have time to discuss those exceptions in detail, but they are interesting. On the whole, what we see is that there are more victims in industries that are bigger. So the bigger the industry, the more victims we see in that industry. And so our suggestion is that the the selection of the victim or the suitability of the victim is not a factor of the industry that they're in. The attackers are not using industry as a sort of variable to guide who becomes a victim. And I'll give you another piece of data that supports that theory. So this shows the distribution of numbers of industries across the different actors. So you'll see Conti, who we referred to right in the beginning, who were responsible for the Costa Rica hack. They have in excess of 20 different victims in their 20 different industries in their list of victims. And so it continues, by the time you get to Babuk and Darkside, you're at 15 different industries. By the time you get to like almost unknown players like Zing and Entropy and Sunscript, you still have more than 5 different industries. And it's only the last or the smallest of the players right at the end that have 2 or less industries. In other words, these criminals are finding victims across all industries. Industry does not seem to be a predictor of suitability for the victim. We could also consider the question of payment probability, because this is a crime of extortion. You might argue, well, they're targeting industries where businesses are more likely to pay out. And particularly manufacturing, which is the most affected industry. You might think, well, manufacturing has a very high dependency on their data for ongoing operations, and therefore they're more likely to pay out. But what you see on this chart in the orange is the number of victims in that industry, and in the white, mapping to the axis on the right, the percentage of businesses in that industry who have actually paid. And what you'll see is that, in fact, manufacturing has a less than 8% probability of the victim paying, whereas other industries like information, with a very small number of victims, has a higher than 10% probability of that victim paying. In other words, we don't see any real correlation between the number of victims in a given industry and the probability that the victim will pay up. So we don't think that payment probability is a variable that contributes to victim suitability either. What we think is what you're looking at is the results of random targeting. So think of somebody throwing a handful of mud at a map that's stuck to the wall. If you just throw the mud at the wall, what you're going to find is that the mud sticks with a sort of random distribution all across the map, but the countries that are bigger are going to have more mud on them. And you can think of that map as reflecting industry, you can think of that map as reflecting business size, and basically you'll see the same behavior. So let me give you an insight from behind the veil, if you like, into how Conti thinks about victims. So this is a chat that we managed to get access to between 2 members of the Conti gang, Rashev and Pin. Rashev is talking to Pin. Rashev is senior to Pin, and he's chastising Pin for targeting a hospital or extorting a hospital. And he says, look, maybe you didn't know about the ban, but we're not going to go ahead with this attack because we've agreed as Conti, we've agreed not to target hospitals. But Pin responds by saying, but it's not a hospital. And then Rashev says, what? And Pin says, yeah, I looked at it 100 times. Rashev says, but it looks like a hospital. And Pin says, no, look, they've got no resuscitation. They only treat sports injuries, plus they have insurance for $3 million. I studied them very hard. I didn't miss anything. And then Rashev says, okay, but look, we decided not to touch the healthcare sector at all, so we're going to bypass these guys. So there's 2 important things we can learn from this transcript between these 2 criminals. The one is that this victim has already been compromised. At this point, they are not thinking of targeting this hospital. They have already compromised the hospital. What they're discussing is whether they should extort a ransom or not. The other is that they had no idea what this victim was before they started considering the extortion. In other words, there's 2 very distinct phases in this crime. On the one phase, businesses are compromised far and wide. Again, think of throwing mud at the wall. In the other phase, there's a decision made as to whether and how much to extort them for. So the targeting is much more random than I think we think. Here's another example where Mango and Skippy are having a discussion, and in this case, they're discussing again a victim who's already been compromised. Mango's asking Skippy to do some research on this victim to understand who and what they are and how much could be extorted from them. There you see the phrase, what can be extorted from them. And then Mango goes on to say it's like some kind of city. And then that word Shtorli is from Russian, and we believe it's kind of the equivalent of a shrug. It's like, I think there's some kind of city, I don't really understand. So in this case, they've got a victim and they don't even know what the victim is in terms of the nature of the business, which supports the thesis that targeting is not deliberate. Having said all of that, I did point out that the numbers overall have been decreasing somewhat. And I did point out that the political pushback from the Revil attack against Kaseya did have some effect on the numbers. And I want to take a moment just to show you a slightly deeper insight into what's been happening with the numbers over the last 12 months. So this shows a comparison between the last 6 months in our data and the 6 months before that. And what you can see is that big economies like Canada, Europe, the UK, and particularly the US have been dropping significantly. So in the US, over that period, we saw a 28% decrease in the number of victims. In fact, overall, the US's proportion of the database of victims has dropped from 65% to about 42%. But at the same time, there are other economies where either it's dropping much slower or it's actually increasing. You see the Nordics, sort of the general category of other, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, East Asia, outside of China. The victims in those economies are all increasing. And what we think that suggests is that there may be some resistance, some increased resistance now to victims in those economies where there is likelihood of pushback, political, law enforcement, technical, whatever the case is, but that simply the crime is now moving to other economies where they don't enjoy that kind of protection. So having determined that there are very few technical elements that contribute to the suitability of the victim, routine activity theory does give us a handle on what kind of, if you like, non-technical attributes make a victim more suitable. And it does it through this acronym that researchers call VIVA. VIVA stands for visibility, inertia, access, and value. And the argument is that these five, we split them into 6 variables, determine how likely or how suitable a given business is as a victim of this crime. And the first V refers to visibility and vulnerability. In other words, how much do you have exposed, if you like, on the outside of your premises? How much do you have exposed that's accessible from the internet? And how robust is it? So if it's exposed and it's not patched, for example, you're more likely to fall victim to if it's not exposed or it isn't patched. The second variable is inertia. And inertia speaks to how easy or hard it is to move a stolen asset. So remember my example about the electric appliances in the baby boomer period? It was very clear that something like a microwave or a television is easier to steal than something like a fridge. And therefore, the easier it is for an attacker to move, access, and work with stolen digital resources, the more likely they are to be stolen. The A in Viva, the second V in Viva refers to value. And again here, we're not talking about the value of the asset to the criminal, we're talking about the value of the asset to the victim. So if, for example, the victim has multiple redundant copies of data or of a technology, then it is less likely that the criminal will be able to extort you. And the very obvious way we can exercise this variable is by having backups in place. But I think thinking about it this way allows us to think of other ways to inject higher levels of redundancy into our technologies or reduce the value of digital assets to us, so we're less likely to be a victim of extortion if those assets are stolen. And then the final A refers to available access or access, which basically means how free is the criminal to move around in your environment without being detected. And to the extent that we can reduce that amount of time, reduce that freedom, we're able to reduce the likelihood that this crime will occur. So if we think about the suitable victim and we think about ways that the victim can be made less suitable, then what the theory suggests to us is that we need to reduce visibility and vulnerability, increase the inertia of our digital value, assets and systems, minimize access time, and decrease value. And all of these are complex topics, I know, and we won't have time to go into them in detail. But I believe that thinking about the suitability of the victim through this lens gives us access to a whole lot of other levers that we might not otherwise have thought about. Right, and then the last pillar, of course, is guardianship. Now, guardianship, as I said to you, is a person or object that provides some kind of protection. It inserts itself somehow between the victim and the perpetrator. And very importantly for Cohen and Felsen, when they devised the theory, this guardian had to be visible. So having a secret control in place was not considered an effective deterrent. It could only have a deterrent effect if it was visible to the criminal. And the most obvious way in which guardianship can be manifest in cyberspace is through the deployment of security technologies. Security technologies map very directly to things like locks and gates. And so they're very tempting for us to think of those things as the guardians that we need. But if that were true, then the assumption would be that businesses with smaller spends would have less technology in place and would therefore be more likely to be victims. But if we look at the data regarding the financial resources of the victims, then what we see is that a very significant proportion of the victims in our database have very significant resources. And I can't share with you the names of the victims, but I can tell you with certainty that very many of the victims are businesses that have access to every imaginable security technology that there is. And so if the revenue of a business can be allowed to act as a proxy for the access that business has to security technologies and controls, then it is clear to us that the availability of security controls does not act effectively as a guardian in the way that Cohen and Felsen imagined. And again, I could discuss this at great length, but we won't have time for it now. What I want to do is to emphasize that in Cohen and Felsen's conceptualization of routine activity theory, they focused not on the role of technical controls, also not on the role of law enforcement in the sort of traditional role of, policemen in uniforms who make arrests, but rather they focused on the role that community played in securing an environment. And again, I very deliberately shared with you the observation they made about the impact it had when women started going to work during the day. And that was because having people at home generally had a deterrent effect, not only for that home owner, but also for other homes in the area. because families were effectively watching out for each other. And when families stopped watching out for each other because nobody was around, Cohen and Felsen observed that crime in a neighborhood would increase. And so there's this interesting call, I guess, that emerges from routine activity theory to think about the idea of security being something that we don't just do for ourselves, but something that we do for each other by understanding and exploring the notion of community in cyberspace, which is obviously not something that's easy to conceptualize. But one way to think about it comes from, one analogy for it, I guess, comes from the work of Stephen Covey, who you may remember as the author who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And Covey points out that in the evolution of a person, but I think it could also be in the evolution of an organization, you start by evolving at the bottom of his little picture here from dependence, meaning you need others to survive, to independence, meaning you can kind of look after yourself. And you evolve from there into what's called interdependence, which is understanding that a community flourishes, or that individuals flourish when they work together with and through communities. And so there are several pointers, I guess, both from routine activity theory and other forms of theory that call us to think about and look at this idea of community. And I already shared with you earlier a screenshot from a Neighborhood Watch poster. So I want to share another one with you briefly, which is from a Neighborhood Watch website in a community near where I live. And I want to just point out some of the key attributes that these real-world Neighborhood Watch programs claim. The first is that a Neighborhood Watch program involves several formal structures. So it involves partnership with this police service, with the community policing forum, local authorities, security service providers, those are commercial offerings, but above all, the individuals and families who want to make their neighborhood a safer place to live. So the notion of community watch or neighborhood watch starts with the idea that communities band together in order to reduce the probability of crime occurring in their neighborhoods. In other words, in order to act as capable guardians. The next thing to note is that these forums have fall under the auspices of other constitutional and legal frameworks. And finally, they depend very heavily on constant communications. So, in the old days of Cohen and Felsen, I suppose people would have phoned each other. Today, there's radios and cell phones and apps and things that allow members of a community to stay in touch the whole time in order to act as guardians for one another. So if you break it down and you look at the notion of guardianship, if you look at the notion of neighborhood watches as a form of guardian, then what we see is that they work together with government. There's a role for government. They are, however, community-led. So the initiatives start with the potential victims, not with the government or with the service providers. They call for visibility, meaning they have to be continuously engaged. They have to act as a visible deterrent to the criminal. They partner with professional services, so people like Orange Cyberdefense, but they are not led by those services or initiated by them. And then finally, there is a large emphasis on the sharing of intelligence, which is done in a very local way, rather than by co-opting resources from elsewhere. So if you look at the capable guardian, the three kind of takeaways that emerge for us in examining this part of the triumvirate is, firstly, guardianship has to be made more visible. Secondly, adding technology, even in the form of security technology, increases visibility, it doesn't decrease it. So it's not necessarily effective as a form of guardianship. And thirdly, that there is this place for community security, which emerges from Cohen and Felson's understanding of how crime is combated, is manifest in modern society, in the real world, in the shape of things like Neighborhood Watch, but is yet to really find form in cyberspace, and becomes a very interesting topic, I think, for further discussion. And that is all I have time for. In fact, I've gone over my time a little bit. Rosanna, I think we have 5 minutes left. We can hand over for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Charl. And you seem to be speaking our language, you know, because our campaign is the community of cyber hero, and the concept of community being so strong we are so connected. And also, community is really one of the most important components of what we do, the GÉANT community, exactly. The research and education community.
Yes, I noticed that.
And it's all, you know, you've tied it all really nicely for us. And thank you very much because of of the angle and the journey that you've taken to take us here. So I've really enjoyed your presentation once again. So if there is anybody who would like to ask Charl some questions, we are open for the next few minutes. Please don't be shy, fire away, or you can put your questions in the chat, and we can read them out loud, or you can actually we'll be able to unmute you and enable you to speak up if you want to be visible in this. So just let us know. We are here. I mean, I did enjoy the sociological and psychological approach, and the umbrella vision, the top level type of approach that it is going to be really a good starting point for decision makers who need to understand better how to coordinate and organize and protect their organization. It's brilliant.
You know, I find it so interesting, Rosanna, because we in cybersecurity, we've been raised in this mindset where risk is calculated for an individual organization and then managed down to an acceptable level for that organization. And that's the way, you know, all our systems and processes and the commercial offerings all work like that. You know, we can help you reduce your risk. And I think what looking at the security problem through these other lenses offers us is the awareness that risk sometimes needs to be managed collectively, where you can't do it for yourself. You have to do it as a community. It's the only way you're going to be effective. And that's not, you know, we've no practice at that really. So we're still learning, you know, how to go about that. But I think these kinds of perspectives, I suppose, inspire us to do that maybe a bit more.
Yes, it's an incredible insight, in fact, and I think we have some notification from Leonardo. Leonardo Marino says that at the end, okay, all participants are able to take part in a survey. Because obviously we are this is the second year in a row that we have organized this series, this program of webinars, and we would like to know how we can make it better and how can improve it going forward. But also there's a full program. Actually, I thought it was the survey, but it is not the survey. Sorry, it's a notification of the program of webinars that will take place throughout the month of October. Do we have any questions? Leo, will you be able? Cornelia, please go ahead.
Am I okay? Thank you.
Yes, hello. Hi, Cornelia.
Hi. Really enjoyed the talk. Thanks so much. Gave me a lot of sort of input, a lot of thoughts, and I have two questions really. One is the whole business about extortion. So as you said, or as well, my colleagues tell me from who sort of work on the more technical sides of ransomware, tell me that the leaking information and making it public, or this is also what we see with some of our clients, has become one of the models, right? And there is, or I don't know, I have heard this theory that, you know, once it becomes sort of normal, that, you know, it can happen to anyone, that you get ransom, or that you have this form of attack, then it would be less likely that people are willing to pay, and therefore less likely to, I don't know, be sustained as a model to make income for criminals. That's, well, let's start with that one. What do you think about that argument?
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think the theory predicts it, because the theory predicts that the victim must have something of value that can be taken away from them. And in the current form of extortion, they call it double extortion, is the sort of contemporary name. Firstly, they take the actual asset from you, and then they threaten to take your reputation from you. So if you have backups that allow you to recover that asset, and your reputation is no longer at risk because the crime has become normalized, then you're absolutely right. We would expect double extortion to decrease, and I think that is happening. But the theory further predicts that what the criminal wants is not your data or your reputation per se. They just want something that's of value to you. So what we anticipate will happen is that this the crime will continue to evolve, and it's already gone through, you know, several permutations over the last few years. But because there's still a motivated offender, there's still suitable victims, and there's still a lack of guardianship, we think that effectively the ingredient that needs to shift is just what the asset is. And one can speculate about how that will evolve in the future, but we think it's wise to assume that the criminals will identify another form of asset that can be taken from you, or that they can threaten to take from you for extortion. I hope that answers that question. Did you have a follow-up question, Cornelia?
Need to unmute Cornelia.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So the follow-up question is really related to what you actually already said, which is the whole concept of, you know, what is actually the asset that is of value, or, you know, really the crown jewels to the organization itself. So I'm thinking in terms of, I'm also a member of an NREN. So, you know, obviously, you know, that is one of our greatest assets that has, if the NREN is impacted in whatever way, that has a massive effect on the whole community of you know, education and research and innovation. And do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's very difficult to change it. You see what I mean? Because, you know, this is what, you know, what everyone relies on, that our services are up and running. That's our core, well, that's our core business. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've got two thoughts. I'm not sure if they're that useful, but it's kind of what pops in my mind. The first is I do think that one of the contributing factors to the scale of this crime up to now is that the two things that have been stolen, which is access to your data and the sanctity of your reputation, I suppose, are quite universal. And so they allowed this crime to scale at a very dramatic rate, right? Because all the potential victims had the same two things. When the thing that's of value to you becomes more bespoke, more unique, it's less likely to become, if you like, commoditized and industrialized under crime. So that maybe there's a bit of solace in that. So that's a thought on the one end, I suppose, of that question. A a thought on the other end of that question is that so far we've identified two things that get stolen. The one is the data itself, its availability, and the other is the reputation of the business. And our response to the availability threat has been to have technical backups. So, you know, if this data gets stolen, can we recover it from somewhere else? I suspect that that response is still massively naive, in the sense that I think that we could go about architecting systems, and maybe more importantly, processes that are much more resilient, in much more organic ways. And I'll just give an example of that. We had a customer who looked at their threat model, looked at their business operations and said, well, you know, we're worried about this ransomware threat, and, you know, what if they do denial of service, or what if they steal this data, or what if they encrypt these computers? We wouldn't be able to operate. But the thing that they really needed to do was be able to pay contractors and salaries. And so what they put in place was effectively a kind of a fallback logic that would, at the end of every month, if the sort of underlying platforms were down, from a location in the cloud, would just pay out like minimum estimates of what was owed to everyone. And so basically my point is that they implemented resiliency and robustness, not at the data level, but at the business process level. And I think if we start to think about the threat as something where something of value is taken away from us, then you can start to think of the solution not in terms of sort of tactical, technical controls like backup and recovery, but rather in terms of how we architect and organize our business processes so that we can continue to operate even some of those underlying assets are impacted in some way. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, sorry, I kept muting myself again. Very useful. That makes me think very much that, or if I'm understanding you correctly, one good way would also to think about it can happen to anyone. We need to be really good firefighters, and our business needs to be ready for it when it happens. And if we can mitigate it, and I'm not talking about it in technical terms, but as an organization as a whole, to get up and running as quickly as possible. Is that?
Yeah, and I think to be as organically robust as you can be. So, you know, how do you reduce your dependency on individual assets or systems at a fundamental business level, so that if one of those things were to be taken away from you somehow, your business would still be able to operate?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cornelia. Excellent questions and excellent observations. So I think that we can wrap it up. It's now 15 past the hour, and it's been a really busy webinar, and we've had 56 participants of the 100 registered. So we are still happy with these numbers, and hopefully you will go back to your desks or whatever you're going to do with a lot of food for thought, and be ambassadors for your organizations. So as I said earlier on, Leonardo has posted the link to the survey. It would be great if you could take what, you know, it's going to take just probably 20 seconds to complete it. It's very easy, straightforward questions. And if you could do that, that would be great. And with that, we say goodbye to next week, where there will be the next webinar on Thursday, today, 13th of October. And say goodbye to everybody. Thank you very much to everybody who has joined, and to the fantastic translators, and to Orange for lending us Charl. And so goodbye, everybody, and thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me again. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.